In our study of the synthesis of yoga, we found that Sri Aurobindo describes in meticulous detail the means and processes and stages of the transformation of the mind by the supramental consciousness. And we observed that it is a similar process that takes place by which the supramental transforms also the life energy and the physical consciousness. But in the synthesis of yoga itself, Sri Aurobindo did not elaborate on this part much. Instead, he makes an observation that the physical consciousness and its transformation awaits the power of the gnosis. Subsequently, in a series of articles, which were the last series that he wrote, he describes in great detail the means by which the physical consciousness is to be awakened, perfected, and transformed, both on the individual level as well as its extension in the collective life, in the collective material life of humanity. The first of these articles was simply titled A Message, which was the message he gave when the Bulletin of Physical Education was started in the ashram. In this, he discusses what he calls a relative perfection of the physical consciousness and the use of sports and games for developing this. He enumerates, and you will see in the sequence there is a development. He enumerates the stages or the objectives for the physical training of consciousness. The most obvious, the most common, mundane, which touches everybody in humanity, is health, strength, and fitness. But from there he builds step by step the character and discipline, and then from there the next step he speaks of awakening the essential and instinctive body consciousness, from which there can be this harmony and spontaneous right movement. And already in these 3 steps, you see how he is lifting the aim of physical education towards something which is approaching at least a preparation of a spiritual possibility. But this is still on an individual level. He then widens this to the collective level by speaking of development of the sporting spirit, which is the interface between the individual life and the collective life. And then in the collective domain, again, discipline, obedience, and teamwork. And from there, leadership. From there, collective and orchestrated action. And how these will determine the success of a nation in achieving its, in fulfilling its objectives. So this brings it to the goal of national development. And all of this he describes as a relative perfection of the physical consciousness. Because this is as much as we can take the physical training without bringing into it a higher goal than that which would be acceptable to the normal life. There is not yet in this obviously a spiritual goal. At best you can say it's a preparation for a spiritual life or a preparation for a spiritual potential. If nothing else, it is what will make the existing collective life more perfect, more effective, and so on. In the context of this collective orchestrated action and its value for national development, it is interesting to look at the recent events that have taken place in Japan, where you see how a nation is brought into crisis by circumstances of nature, but how the nation responds to that crisis and the example that it sets for the rest of the world. You see here a level of discipline where, unlike most other countries, there is no theft, there is no public chaos or disorder, in spite of very large numbers of people being displaced without shelter or food for weeks together. Not one person asserts personal convenience or personal greed over the collective need. And even it went to the extent that people bought food only as much as they needed immediately so that there is enough for everybody else. To the extent that while clearing out debris, when they found packets of money or valuables, these were handed over to the local police. And this shows a level of discipline, order, which is extraordinary and gives you a hint of why Japan has been so successful as a nation in whatever it has sought to realize. It is when such a coordinated, disciplined collective action is turned to a still higher potential or a spiritual potential that you have, in a sense, a similar potential of success even in the spiritual domain. If such a nation were to seek to realize a harmony based on the spirit, certainly it would make those steps much more rapidly. So these are indications, but after this, Sri Aurobindo moves on to the perfection of the body from the spiritual perspective. Again, in this context, I am reminded of Mother's observations when in the 50s, the Russian gymnasts, Olympic gymnasts, had visited the ashram, and they stayed here for a few days, coming then from a communist background, rejecting spirituality. They were on what would be called a public relations tour, and as one of the special places, they came to the ashram also. But here, obviously, there was a different dimension. After all those extraordinary demonstrations, Mother, it seems, made a comment. She said their physical consciousness was so well trained. If they had a little bit of spirituality, they would have been like gods. And this was narrated to us by one of our captains who was a student then. So this comment must have spread among many. But it shows again that with the physical consciousness and its physical training, one can go an extraordinary degree to create a basis for the spiritual transformation. It is towards this that the next chapter or the next article in the series takes us. And this is titled Perfection of the Body. And the article after that is titled The Divine Body. So you see the development also, how he's moving towards that. So perfection of the body will now take us through a journey before the divinization of the body, after completion of this basic training of discipline and awakening the essential and instinctive body consciousness. What is the degree to which this perfection of the physical consciousness can be taken? So far, we have not aimed even at perfection, or at best we can call it a relative perfection. But is there a greater perfection? Is there a perfection that approaches the spiritual while still being the physical consciousness, not yet transformed, not yet divinized? And what Sri Aurobindo indicates here is there is in fact an extraordinary degree of progress possible for the physical consciousness even without the spiritual transformation. if the physical opens even a little bit to the subliminal, the subtle physical, or even the mental consciousness, and we have not yet spoken of the spiritual, it can go very far, and it seems as if its potential is limitless. But then into that, if we bring the spiritual and the action of the spiritual consciousness, then this potential can be fully realized. How this is done? What are the various kinds of psychological and material processes that are assisting this is what this chapter looks at. It's a long chapter, and we will take a little while to go through it. But first he places before us the context. What is this perfection? And perfection of the body in the context of the larger perfection and the divine life. He begins, the perfection of the body, as great a perfection as we can bring about by the means at our disposal, must be the ultimate aim of physical culture. Perfection is the true aim of all culture, the spiritual and psychic, the mental, the vital, and it must be the aim of our physical culture also. So the moment we speak of culturing, there is this idea of gradually refining and developing a potential. So how far or which direction does that refinement go? The moment you speak of refining, you could perhaps list 10 different kinds of change you could bring. But where do they all aim at? Eventually, he says, they all aim at perfection. It's the true aim of all culture. If our seeking is for a total perfection of the being, so you can have a culturing aiming at perfection, but a partial perfection. So if our seeking is for a total perfection of the being, the physical part of it cannot be left aside, for the body is the material basis, the body is the instrument which we have to use. So here he is using two terms to describe the body, its material basis and its instrument. It's a basis because everything else rests on that. You drop the body and then, well, you can't act in the material world. So you have to have that as your basis and you have to act through it. But the second function of the body is that it is an instrument. Using it, you can do other things. You can do things in the world, but you can also do things upon the rest of your consciousness. For example, if nothing else, through the physical body's experiences of the world, your mind grows. And many other kinds of subtle or spiritual development are possible, with the body as the instrument and vehicle for those experiences. So both of these are functions of the body, the material base for everything in the world, but also the instrument for things outside or on other levels of consciousness. He quotes from, in Sanskrit, Shariram khalu dharma sadhanam, says the old Sanskrit adage. The body is the means of fulfillment of dharma. Shariram is the body, khalu, truly, sadhanam, fulfillment, dharma, dharma sadhanam, fulfillment of dharma. And what is this dharma? He explains. And dharma means every ideal which we can propose to ourselves and the law of its working out and its action. So here's a very interesting description of dharma. Dharma, as it is normally described, is the truth, the divine truth as it turns to manifest, taking on forms. Here he gives the definition of the same thing seen from below. The view from above is the truth manifesting, and the right action, the form that truth takes, the true form, the natural form, the spontaneous expression of it is dharma. When seen from below, we look up and we say, what is divine truth? We don't know that. It's abstract. It's not real to me. Even my mind doesn't understand it. But from below we can say, I have an ideal. And that ideal can be worked out, can be brought into action bit by bit. But I have one ideal, you have another ideal, and together we might have innumerable ideals. So he says, dharma means every ideal which we can propose to ourselves. I might not be interested in XYZ ideals, but certainly I can propose them. And if you take all those ideals together, that brings you to the highest truth of the divine, because each ideal represents a facet, a fragment, an aspect of that truth. So every ideal which we can propose to ourselves and the law of its working out and its action. So that's that process of taking form. How does that ideal work itself out? In action. And that's dharma. So for dharma and for fulfillment of dharma, or to put it in other words, for realizing all the ideals which we are drawn to, the body is the means. This is the quotation, an old Sanskrit adage, he says. A total perfection is the ultimate aim which we set before us, for our ideal is the divine life which we wish to create here. The life of the spirit fulfilled on earth. Divine life he has capitalized because something very specific is meant. Not just a happy, beautiful, organized, aesthetically perfected life, but by capitalizing divine, he says, he reminds us that it is the highest possibility of the divine himself that must be manifested. The life of the spirit fulfilled on earth, and again capitalizing spirit. There are many communities today who use the word divine and divine life, but to mean what may be called intermediate ideals. Some kind of ideal realized, some kind of working harmony, and they will be satisfied to call it divine life. But here Sri Aurobindo means something very specific, and he means the highest transformation. So life accomplishing its own spiritual transformation even here on earth in the conditions of the material universe. And the even is very suggestive. What it says is, life is not bound to the material plane. There is the whole world of life in its own plane. And in its own plane, it is quite perfect. It is quite perfect as it is. And it can even seek to realize a kind of a spiritual transformation in its own plane. And it doesn't have much resistance because there is not the resistance of matter there. And there are, in fact, these worlds of life which are full of the spiritual power and light, and which we may even call spiritually transformed. But the point is, we want life achieving that spiritual transformation even here on earth in the conditions of the material universe, not just in the life world. So here the condition is much harder. In matter, life is already bound. And that bound life must be, of course, freed and then transformed and made divine. And obviously this is not possible unless matter itself participates, because it is matter that is holding back life. Matter not only must let go, but must accept to be transformed as life is being transformed. So this is much more difficult. So he says that cannot be unless the body too undergoes a transformation. You want to transform life, you want to create a divine life on earth, in matter, then the body must participate. Why body? Why not the rest of matter? Well, the rest of matter is inconscient. Body is the part of the universe which has already been made alive by life. And now if life becomes divinized, it is in this tissue that it can most likely transform, and not in the inconscient matter. So the focus now comes straight on our physical body. That cannot be unless the body too undergoes a transformation, unless its action and functioning attain to a supreme capacity and the perfection which is possible to it or which can be made possible. If life has to become expressive of infinite potential, then even the physical consciousness in which life inhabits must be capable of the same infinite potential. And so it requires actually for the physical consciousness to go to what he has used here, attain to supreme capacity and the perfection which is possible to it or which can be made possible. Now here comes an area where we might say, this body cannot do certain things. About 100 years ago, maybe 130 or so years ago, they used to say and scientifically prove with all kinds of formulae of physics that if a human being runs faster than a horse, the body will break apart. And this was proved. Subsequently, we have not only run faster than horses, but every 4 years with the Olympics, you find the world speed record breaking. And every time we say we have reached the limits of what the human tissue is capable of, muscles cannot move faster than this, we find somebody else breaks through that limit and goes a little further and a little further. So to say that there is a limit to the capacity of the body might not be quite right, and yet you can say with our present understanding that's all the body can do. But he says, which is possible to it, this is possible, the rest is not possible, but which can be made possible. And the moment you bring this idea, straight away all the limits dissolve. We could say perhaps by genetic tinkering, we might be able to help the tissue to be able to move faster. Isn't it? So the moment you say which might be made possible, it's as if all the limits vanish. Perhaps with a suitable diet, one can push the limits up to here, but that's the limit of your genes. But if you get over the genetic limitations, you could go even more. If you can find one creature on earth with tissue that moves faster than your muscle can, then potentially that genetic variation can be put into our genes and our tissue could be made as fast. Is there a limit to that? And that's part of the speculative space. The moment you say which can be made possible, perhaps even that we can gradually replace the particular materials used in this tissue by other materials and so speed up, strengthen, make more plastic, etc. without limits. Perhaps. So the idea here is attain to a supreme capacity and perfection which is possible to it or which can be made possible, and all the way. And we will see subsequently that in fact there is practically no limit to what the physical consciousness and subsequently the body itself can realize. Sri Aurobindo makes I'm anticipating, but it's useful to keep this as context after several pages. He speaks of how far the physical body consciousness and body tissue can be taken without the spiritual intervention, but just by bringing in the subliminal influences and the occult influences and the action of mind on the physical consciousness. And with that, he says, it looks as if there is no limit. Then when the spiritual comes into it, then it goes even further. And I will share with you certain interesting descriptions of people who have worked on this particular part of the consciousness without the spiritual training, purely by bringing in the occult influence on the physical consciousness and pushed the body to limits which normally we would consider biologically and physically impossible. It seems as if even the laws of biology and chemistry are overcome by just that application of the subliminal influences. There's some interesting literature of people who have been pushed into those limits through hypnosis and other means. One such, and I just give that as an example here, a person who is thrown into freezing cold water, but under hypnosis he has been told this is warm and comfortable, and he is able to swim in that water literally for hours. When one of the observing scientists fell into it by mistake, he was blue in the face and was in serious medical condition within a minute or so. But for a couple of hours, this man under hypnosis continues swimming, except that he notices that his skin is becoming raw, as if the skin is peeling off, becoming red. But he feels nothing. He is feeling warm and comfortable. And he comes out of it and he can move around quite normally, except he notices that all the tissue is as if peeling off from all over. So what's happening is there are two levels of the consciousness. One is the most material part of the tissue, which certainly is being damaged by that extreme cold. But there's another part which is the functional tissue and the consciousness in the body, which is feeling exactly as it wants to feel. And these distinctions are important, and Sri Aurobindo will make them also as we go along. But this shows that things which we consider impossible biologically are actually not so impossible. But we'll continue with this now. I have already indicated in a previous message, and that's the previous article, a relative perfection of the physical consciousness in the body, and of the mind, the life, the character which it houses, as no less than an awakening and development of the body's own native capacities, a desirable outcome of the exercises and practices of the physical culture, to which we have commenced to give in this ashram a special attention and scope. So in this context now you can see why these practices were brought into our ashram as a routine, although ostensibly more for the children's education, but also extended to sadhaks for this use, which he is going to elaborate on. So he makes an interesting comment here. Relative perfection of physical consciousness in the body, and of the mind, the life and character which it houses. So through the physical training, you are also aiming at a relative perfection of the mind, life and character. This goes to show that the physical training is not just for the body, but impacts the whole being, and even can be made a means for overcoming limitations of the mental or vital consciousness. I'm reminded of an interesting example which came to our attention recently. One of the early sadhakas of the ashram, by the name of Acharya Abhaydev, he had attained great progress in the traditional path towards self-realization, and was already a guru and a teacher, a spiritual teacher to many in his own ashram. Having come in contact with Sri Aurobindo, he recognized here that his own destiny was in the practice of the integral yoga, and he came to the ashram, asked to be a disciple of Sri Aurobindo, and Sri Aurobindo said to him, "You have already attained great progress in your own path. If you now take this path, you will have to start all over again from the beginning, concentrating on the psychic realization first. Would you be willing to do that?" And Acharya Bhaidev said, "Yes, I am." And so he was taken in as a disciple. It's an unusual example as somebody who was told to start again afresh, but from a different basis. But it is not an unusual example in the sense of a great guru already established as a spiritual teacher coming to Sri Aurobindo, recognizing in him something still greater which he needed. There were many such like him, Kapali Shastriyar himself being one of them, and others, all of whom had attained in the traditional path of sadhana great realizations, including, as in Kapali Shastriyar's case, attaining to self-realization before they came to Sri Aurobindo. And this shows very clearly that the path that Sri Aurobindo set was recognized by these realized people as something completing or perfecting or taking to a new level what they could recognize to be the greater fulfillment of evolution. That's why in one of the praises composed to Sri Aurobindo by Kapali Shastriyar, he describes him as Guru Nam Guru, he who is the guru of other gurus, the teacher of teachers. So when Acharya Bhadev came here and Sri Aurobindo accepted him as disciple, he said to him, there is a certain resistance and a block in your mental consciousness. And to get rid of it, he suggested that he practice certain exercises of asanas and pranayam. This is interesting, and this is the example I wanted to bring in. To get rid of certain blockages in the mental consciousness, the practice of asanas and pranayam, of Hatha Yoga. Normally we would view asanas and pranayam as having purely physical results, or at best results of the prana. But to get rid of a block in the mental consciousness, to work on through those. And that was the example I wanted to bring in. And these are all indicative that through training and awakening of physical consciousness, everything else is also affected. Purely from the logical understanding, we recognize that in the physical body, all three are bound to each other, mind, life and body. They are bound, although the mental consciousness can stand back and become relatively free, it still is housed in the physical. And if you were to inject the proper chemicals in the bloodstream, well, the mind just shuts down and goes to sleep because it's bound with the physical. Recognizing this, if the support of the physical consciousness now becomes wider, plastic and free, automatically on all other levels, whatever you wish to do becomes so much easier, and because it's free. The supporting base now assists. So this phrase, houses it, is in this to be seen in this context. The relative perfection of the physical consciousness in the body and of the mind, the life, the character which it houses, as no less than an awakening and development of the body's own native capacities. Now here is the other key. Within the body are capacities not yet obvious, but they are natural and native to its own consciousness. That also to be awakened and developed. These two steps are important, of which he will speak a lot later. A development of the physical consciousness must always be a considerable part of our aim. But for that, the right development of the body itself is an essential element. Health, strength, fitness are the first needs. But the physical frame itself must be the best possible. So this is quite a statement, the best possible. What's the best that's possible for you? And that development is a considerable part of our aim. Even one may say, and Sri Aurobindo gave this much importance, the genetic basis should be given a certain consideration in the overall human development. There was at one time, about 100 years ago, this idea prevalent in humanity that having just recognized that the genetic basis has a certain law of transmission, there was recognized the value given to selecting good genes for the long-term future of humanity. Eugenics is the term used, and selective breeding for a better physical base. There was, of course, allied with it the idea that those with defective genes should be eliminated. And naturally that became a bit of a perversion which was misused at certain times. And as a result, the idea of eugenics today has fallen into is seen in a bad light. But the principle is valid, and it is in fact a principle that the soul takes into consideration when it takes birth. When the soul chooses the environment for its birth, it looks not only at the psychological environment of consciousness, but also at the physical base which is provided there. And where possible, it will look for the kind of imprint of the physical consciousness useful for the type that it wants to develop. So there are, for example, in the genetic transmissions, certain psychological tendencies which are also transmitted. You will find communities or families where physical vitality is given great stress. There are certain other sides which are weakened, or along with this physical vitality will be certain side effects of tendency for excess in its expression, or tendency for anger. Or similarly, where a lineage has emphasized in its genetic transmission the refinement and subtlety of the mental consciousness or sensitivity of the emotional being, it makes the overall temperament delicate, sensitive, and as a side effect weak in certain respects, incapable of aggression or weak in opposing or handling aggression from others and things like that. Now these are all part of the game, so to say, of life on earth. But where possible and where the soul is conscious, it tries to choose the temperament which will best express the kind of life experience that it wants. So if it gets good material basis, certainly it's a good thing. Where it doesn't get, well, it accepts a compromise. Well, this space, this culture is more important. Even if the body is not so good, can't help it. I prefer the base of culture. And it takes that. But ideally, if we could also take that into account, make it the best possible, the physical frame itself must be the best possible. Apart from the genetics with which we come, we can build that frame. We can overcome the limits of the genes and create what is necessary. So that can be done two ways. One is purely by material and psychological means, and the other is by the spiritual action. Both of these he will discuss subsequently. So here he comes to the whole rationale now. Why the body and why the need for a strong base. A divine life in a material world implies necessarily a union of the two ends of existence, the spiritual summit and the material base. The soul, with the basis of its life established in matter, ascends to the heights of the spirit, but does not cast away its base. It joins the heights and the depths together. The spirit descends into matter and the material world with all its lights and glories and powers, and with them fills and transforms life in the material world, so that it becomes more and more divine. So here we see this double movement of evolution. First of all, the soul got into matter, material life. Established in matter, it ascends to the heights of the spirit. But in the ascension, you will see at every step of evolution, it's not that the soul drops the base before. It's not like climbing a ladder where you leave behind every rung. In a sense, We don't have a suitable analogy here, but in a sense, it's like wrapping up the ladder and taking up every rung into the next rung, ascending the scale of evolution with the material that you started with, so that that material becomes as the next consciousness. Matter is transformed with each step of the rise of the soul. So you have dead matter, you have living matter, you have conscious matter, and now you have self-conscious matter, and next we will have superconscious living matter, and then you have material that is the very substance of divinity, of spirit. And that will be the culmination of what we call the physical transformation. But this is the movement of ascent. Obviously, with each step of the ascent, there is a new potential now available because of a new consciousness, and immediately from above, things fill in to use that potential. So that's the other movement, spirit descending into matter and the material world with all its lights and glories and powers. This is in the evolution, it's a slow process. With each up step, there is something of the higher that fills, which fills and transforms. And again, one more step, again a descent, fills and transforms, and so on. So fills and transforms life in the material world so that it becomes more and more divine. In the yoga, this whole process is accelerated and goes through several cyclic movements of a partial ascent, a descent, another partial ascent and descent, and a repeated series of ascents and descents by which this fusion of the two, so to say, takes place. The transformation is not a change into something purely subtle and spiritual to which matter is in its nature repugnant, and by which it is felt as an obstacle or a shackle binding the spirit. It takes up matter as a form of the spirit, though now a form which conceals, and turns it into a revealing instrument. It does not cast away the energies of matter, its capacities, its methods. So you could have had an evolution where, as we grow into higher consciousness, well, we keep changing our body. First, my body was made of this very crude matter which I have been eating. Now, as I get more and more refined, the substance of my body could change and I could get more and more subtilized until I become half invisible, or at least less dense, and can penetrate gross matter like a half materialized spirit. And eventually I become a creature of the mental world, floating in the physical, in my mental body, having no direct interaction with this ugly, dense, crude matter in which I was bound, from which I have become free. But that's an idea that many traditions have had. That he says this is not what evolution does. It takes up that matter, sees it as form of spirit, but right now this form is concealing. Spirit is hidden, bound. Slowly it's shaping the form to make it form which reveals spirit rather than conceals. But it's form of spirit. And there is this complete binding of the two. There are a few letters of Sri Aurobindo which deal with this issue, because people wrote to him saying, such and such tradition speaks of a divine body. Isn't that the supramental body? Isn't that the transformed body? And Sri Aurobindo points out that many of these traditions actually speak of subtilizing the consciousness and then kind of vanishing into a subtle body, not the transformation of the physical itself. Or if at all they have descriptions which look like a transformation of the physical, they seem to be more experiences of the occult body, which are superimposed on the physical. But whether this tissue itself is taken up, that is doubtful. I have a couple of letters here which are worth reading, not only for this point, but also for a very strange suggestion which one of the sadhaks made to Sri Aurobindo. Having heard that the transformed body would also be luminous, he asks, will the supramental body be radioactive Sri Aurobindo did not laugh it off. He took up the question seriously and answered it in a very interesting way. So we'll just look at some of that quickly. So first he says, from the Veda, he says, it is a luminous body, this is page 1236 to 38. So first he says, it is a luminous body spoken of in the Veda as possessed by the beings of the higher planes. It is supposed by certain schools of yoga in the East and the West that in the final transformation on earth, man will develop a body having these qualities. It was called Cor Gloria, body of glory, by the mother's first spiritual instructor. Now here we see a correspondence. The subtle worlds have their subtle bodies, and the higher planes have that luminous body, body made of substance of truths, body made of Satchidananda. If not in Satchidananda, coming down to the higher planes of the higher mental worlds, body made of substance that reveals that spiritual light and knowledge and power. All of these are seen in various spiritual traditions. And there is this idea, he says, in many, that eventually on earth we will have a body like that. First distinction we make. Not that body, but like that. And a body on earth, not there. That's the second distinction. So it means the physical body itself must acquire qualities similar to that. You could say that body coming down on earth and becoming materialized would be one way of looking at it. Or the physical body transforming evolutionarily to become revealing of those qualities. Either way. In fact, this was the last experiment that the mother did, of which we can understand only in a very superficial way. But when she found there was a resistance in the universal consciousness to the physical transformation of her own body, she made one last experiment. She formed a subtle physical body and then tried to fuse that into the gross physical. And that would have been a kind of a shortcut to transform the physical consciousness. And she said in that effort she did not receive the help or the sanction of the divine, because that would have been a kind of a skipping a step in evolution. It would not be this transforming from within, but something making a jump.
Something like lamination?
Not lamination, fusing it in from within. Lamination would still be a superficial. This is like from inside. Okay. Then there's another letter where someone asks about a description in the Bible of such experiences of light bodies. So it's a long letter. I'll just skip portions but get to the point quickly. He says, I read the Bible very assiduously at one time. When I have looked at it, it has always given me a sense of imprecision in the thought substance, in spite of the vividness of the expression. And that makes it very difficult to be sure about these things. And the point he is making is, there are descriptions, you could interpret them in many ways, and it's not clear whether it is speaking of this substance's transformation. So he refers to Saint Paul had remarkable mystic experiences and certainly much profound spiritual knowledge. Profound rather than wide, I think. I would not swear to it that he is referring to the supramentalized body, physical body. Perhaps to the supramental body or to some other luminous body in its own space and substance, which he found sometimes as if enveloping him and abolishing this body of death, which he felt the material envelope to be. This verse, like many others, is capable of several interpretations and might refer to a quiet supraphysical experience. Then he says, the idea of a transformation of the body occurs in different traditions, but I have never been quite sure that it meant the change in this very matter. There was a yogi some time ago in this region who taught it, but he hoped when the change was complete to disappear in the light. Now, straight away you see, although he's speaking of a transformation of the body, the transformation would be such that you would disappear into the light. And it does not have the same connotation that Sri Aurobindo has of the physical substance transforming to remain as physical substance, though. Then he says, the Vaishnavas speak of a divine body which will replace this one when there is the complete siddhi. But again, is this a divine physical or supra-physical body? At the same time, there is no obstacle in the way of supposing that all these ideas, intuitions, experiences point to, if they do not exactly denote, the physical transformation. So you can say that all of these ideas, whatever has been described, maybe it's not exactly the physical transformation Sri Aurobindo is speaking of, but they all point to something like that. And in that sense, one can say the idea of such a physical transformation has as if been prevalent throughout, from the beginning of the spiritual history. Though not fully understood or described in exactly the same way, but still the idea is there. Then another one. Now this is in relation to this question of radioactivity. There are two letters on that. This one says, unfortunately we don't have the question, but that would have been more interesting. He answers, it has been the idea of many who have speculated on the subject that the body of the future race will be a luminous body, cor gloria, and that might mean radioactive. But also it has to be considered, one, that a supramental body must necessarily be one in which the consciousness determines even the physical action and reaction to the most material, and these therefore are not wholly dependent on material conditions or laws as now known. In other words, the physical laws as we know them would be overcome because consciousness would act directly to determine all physical processes by its laws, not the material laws. So that's one. Second, that the subtle process will be more powerful than the gross. So that a subtle action of Agni will be able to do the action which would now need a physical change such as increased temperature. This is remarkably interesting, of which he will speak directly in some later chapters in what we are now reading. He says, between two processes, the subtle is more powerful than the gross. Because the gross is an external superficial operation of the subtle. The problem is the subtle cannot act presently in the gross body. But once you accept that it is brought in and it now acts, obviously the subtle action will be more powerful than the physical, than the gross action. So in the supramental body, the subtle being more powerful, the subtle action of consciousness, and then its power of Agni, will do the same action which now needs physical change such as increased temperature. Okay, so here we get the whole foundation of occult action. If you want to cook food, you want molecular changes to take place. That's what we call cooking. How do you do it? You light a fire. The temperature goes up. By increased temperature, the molecular changes take place and the food is cooked. This is the physical process. The moment you have brought in the subtle process, Agni can take up the food without physically raising temperature and make those changes which are required, that is, cook it without raising temperature. There's an interesting incident which comes from the life of one of the bhakti saints in Maharashtra, Ranade. So as he was a young boy, how much? 12?
Yes,
13 or 14 years old, having achieved great spiritual realizations, looking after his younger brothers and sisters. And as it turned out, the learned people of his area were quite upset with him because he did not respect or follow their learning. So they created trouble for him. Among other things, they had no food, and then they had no firewood. Having got some alms, they had the wheat flour mixed with water to prepare chapati, but there's no fire. So he said, well, does not matter. You heat it on my back. And he crouches on the ground, offers his back, and his brothers heat the chapati on his back. Now, if you look at this incident, and this was seen by people, if you look at the incident, if the body had become hot, his tissue would burn as much as the chapati, isn't it? Which is certainly more harmful to him. Obviously, the body did not become hot in the conventional sense, and yet there was a heat, or rather, we would say the action of Agni directly on the material placed. And it's significant he did it on the back. Perhaps it has to do with a certain concentration of the force, power, or Agni there in relation to the Kundalini, perhaps. We don't know the details. But the idea being there was a direct action of consciousness of the Agni principle by an occult action on matter, leading to that result, which would normally be done indirectly by temperature going up. In terms of our current understanding of biological working, we can say the present biology is functioning by organizing existing laws of matter in its inconscient stage. The transformed body will function by the material substance directly yielding to the pressure of consciousness. And so working, shaping, operating by the principles of the consciousness that inhabits it, not the habits of the material consciousness or laws of matter, so to say. So it will be the law of spirit acting on and through material substance. And that's the transformed physical body. So there's another letter which speaks of this. If the consciousness cannot determine the physical action and reaction of the present body, if it needs a different basis, then this means this different basis must be prepared by different means. By what means? Physical. The old yogis tried to do it by physical tapasya. Others by seeking the elixir of life, etc. So the whole point is, can consciousness directly act on the physical action and reaction in the body? How do you do it? What's the basis by which consciousness can act directly? So you tried with the physical tapasya or by elixir of life. Then he says, according to this yoga, the action of the higher force and consciousness, which includes the subtle action of Agni, has to open and prepare the body and make it more responsive to consciousness force instead of being rigid in its present habits called laws. So the laws of the body are nothing but habits of the body. And the idea is that this body has to be prepared and made responsive to the consciousness force instead of being stuck in its own laws. In other words, if you saw most obviously, make the body more conscious. Conscious of what? Well, of itself to begin with, of life energies to begin with, of mental awareness, but more and more of the spiritual consciousness itself. If the body is conscious of the divine presence and opens itself to the divine presence, gives itself to the will of the divine presence inhabiting it, that's the process really. When you think in these terms, it sounds so simple. And he says the action of the higher force and consciousness has to open and prepare the body to make it responsive. So who will open the body consciousness? Because the body right now is too dull to know the divine. So in a sense, the higher consciousness has to open to make it aware, and then the body must collaborate. So right now, what's the highest consciousness we have accessible? Our mental awareness. And in a sense, that's what we are doing when we are culturing the body. When I try to do a back somersault or a cartwheel on the gymnastics hall. I am trying to feel my muscles, my nerves, tissue, and trying to shape them to do things which they are not used to. When I extend the capacity of the body in speed or suppleness or strength, I'm again putting my mental awareness into the muscles and trying to make it do something, stretch. What? I'm not aware of the dense tissue itself. I'm aware only of the part of sensation and through it, the tissue. And the part of the tissue which has sensation, I'm able to stretch and extend. I can't do it on my bones because I don't have sensation there. But what I could do, by the same extension, I could visualize as if trying to feel my bones with the same kind of awareness that I apply on my muscles. And in the bones, perhaps imprint a will of an idea. And I would get the same result. I don't get the immediate feedback because the bone does not give me sensation. But in the tissue, I can do it easily. In the bone, I don't know whether it's working. But if I persist, one does have a result. Even the bone form can change. Even the bone can become more plastic, more responsive, etc. In fact, to put it another way, when consciousness withdraws from those parts of the body, and the body as if falls away from your living consciousness, that's when it begins to degenerate or age. That's why you will see the signs of aging or degeneration are always in the parts least conscious. The first illnesses or problems we get are in the parts which are least conscious. Often it's in the feet, unless one has trained the consciousness in the legs, but in most people, knees and feet are, unless you've done gymnastics, they are unconscious. Or the back, and especially the lower back, of which we are rarely aware because we are always concerned with the frontal part of our consciousness, of the body, and so on. But if you observe the things, the problems start in those areas. Work to make that part conscious, and the problems tend to go away. They tend to come back the moment you stop working on those parts again, because the physical consciousness slides back into habit. So it needs a culturing and discipline and a persistence to get it to, so to say, wake up. But if with the mind we can do this much, we can prepare in it the base for a more direct action of the spiritual. Or look at it on two different ways now. The mind, the mental awareness in us can open to the spiritual consciousness. And the mental awareness in us can enter the physical tissue consciousness. So by entering first tissue consciousness and then opening to the spiritual awareness from within tissue, the mind becomes a bridge. Or the mind first opens to the spiritual consciousness and then turns to the tissue and suffuses it, and so becomes a bridge. Two different methods. But both will end with a similar outcome, but the experience itself is different. The other possibility, on another extreme, is that the mind places on the physical consciousness the will for it to awaken, and so creates a direct link or assists in creating a direct link between the physical and the spiritual. And this is a very different kind of action, requiring far greater persistence. But with this kind of action, you can actually have a direct relation from the physical consciousness to the spiritual, even without the mind coming in between as a link. It acts as a provocator for the physical consciousness, helping it to awaken, but does not come in between as a mediator. You could do all three things. Eventually, everything helps the other. Whatever you achieve by one way helps the other way. There was one person in the ashram about whom Mother spoke. He was the director of our physical education program, of whom Mother spoke in these terms. She said to him that his body was made for the experiment of the direct action of the supramental consciousness on the physical, bypassing mind and vital. It's a very interesting statement. We will not fully understand what it implies, but it gives some sense of this, that there is a possibility for the physical consciousness to open directly to the supramental without the need of an intermediary of the mind and vital being transformed first. But it's an experiment, it's a possibility. Certainly, as a process, it helps when the mind or vital has already some contact with the higher consciousness and becomes a mediator or bridge. But still, this is a possibility. So what we need to create, and this is what the letter is about, a means by which the consciousness can determine the physical action and reaction in the present body directly. And it needs a support in the physical for that. So I just continue the text. But a different basis can only be created by the supramental action itself. What else but the supermind can determine its own basis? And then finally the last letter, where again the radioactivity comes back. So the same disciple is writing, why are you evading my questions? And he seems to have asked, what will be the chemical constitution of the transformed body? So somehow this man was thinking that when the body is transformed, it's as if it will use a different set of chemicals. And that's really not what Sri Aurobindo is getting at, but Sri Aurobindo answers that. I did not intend to evade anything except that insofar as I do not yet know what will be the chemical constitution of the changed body, I could not answer anything to that. That was why I said it needed investigation. So obviously the point of transformation is not a new set of chemicals replacing the old, but following their own mechanical laws again. It's about consciousness directly mastering matter and shaping matter. Once it does that, it will have the freedom also to play around with the chemicals, isn't it? So if Sri Aurobindo is asked, what will be the chemical constitution? The first point is, it's not chemical change which is transformation. But the second point is, once it is transformed, the body is not bound to specific chemicals. It could play with many other chemicals also. So that's why he says it needed investigation rather than giving a detailed response. Okay, then he continues. I was simply putting my idea on the matter, which has always been that it is the supramental which will create its own physical basis. If you mean that the supramental cannot fulfill itself in the present body with its present processes, that is true. The processes will obviously have to be altered. How far the constitution of the body will be changed and in what direction is another question. As I said, it may become, as you suggest, radioactive. Theo, mother's teacher in occultism, spoke of it as luminous, le cor gloria. But all that does not make it impossible for the supramental to act in the present body for change. So he makes a distinction. The supramental fulfilling itself in this body, not yet. A lot has to change here. But the supramental acting in the present body for change of the body. Yes, that's possible now. And then he says, it is what I am looking forward to at present. Of course, a certain preliminary transformation is necessary, just as the psychic and spiritual transformation precedes the supramental. But this is a change of the physical consciousness down to the submerged consciousness of the cells, so that they may respond to higher forces and admit them, and to a certain extent a change or at least a greater plasticity in the processes. The rules of food, etc., are meant to help that by minimizing obstacles. There's a very interesting idea here. By certain types of food, you can create more problems in the physical consciousness by increasing its inertia, dullness, creating agitations, poisoning nerves, for example, creating restlessness. And then there are certain foods which can remove those obstructions and help it. And if you want to work on the physical transformation, or at least the physical awakening of consciousness, then certainly we must watch what we eat. There's very interesting research now of effects certain foods have. One of the things they find is the chemical additives which are put in packaged foods for coloring them. They have the effect of creating restlessness in the nerves and promoting what we call attention deficit disorders. Now, the chemicals are added to make food look pretty, but it goes into the nerves and it creates this agitation. And what we want is to bring peace in the nerves, not to create agitation. But there's a physical process there which is hindering the action of consciousness. So certainly we would want to remove those types of obstruction. So he says the rules of food are meant to help by minimizing obstacles. From another perspective, one can say, well, all these new obstacles also have to be conquered eventually. So evolution uses, or let's say the supramental force uses these increasing poisons of the body as occasions also to see how it can overcome those problems. But if we want to speed up our own awakening of physical consciousness, well, let's make the obstacles less if we can. How far this involves a change of the chemical constitution of the body, I cannot say. It seems to me still that whatever preparatory changes there may be, it is only the action of the supramental force that can confirm and complete them. So I think... Pardon?
He didn't investigate, no?
He did. The problem was, he rarely wrote of something unless he had completed his work. He was already working on the physical transformation. He has said a lot, and that's part of the book which we are reading. He has said a lot there. The specifics of the form of the body, those he has left very open for two reasons. One, because the form itself is freely the choice of the supermind, and it could choose anything. But the other side is, if he were to describe specific forms or attributes, we would completely misunderstand. Because it's like the monkey trying to understand the logic. It will play with the symbols, but it won't get the thing itself. And it is a problem which, because of which he held back many things and did not speak of them much. Gave indications, which you will find lots here, but then he didn't go into elaborations. I just give one example. Mother speaks of an experience she had, which she was given by Shiva, in which she saw the whole universe as the body of the divine, and each person like a cell in that body. And it was as if the future to be. And when she came to Sri Aurobindo, he took away the experience and said it is premature. She doesn't speak much of that, why and all that. But if we apply whatever little we understand of these things, we can say, if we try to understand that experience with our present mind, we would immediately start putting ourselves as cells in a larger collective consciousness. And we would begin to visualize society with human beings as cells, and it would be a most harmful understanding because it would suppress the individual flowering and individual freedom. In fact, it was a similar idea which became the basis of very strictly organized societies that crushed individual freedom completely for the good of the larger collective. Whereas what she has described as an experience is a truth that becomes spontaneous when each individual is one in the self. When each individual is one with the whole of the divine consciousness, and then chooses freely the role of so-called cell unit. But each experiences the full experience of each of the others. There is no loss of individual freedom here. In fact, in such an arrangement, even if we speak of cells in the divine body, there would be a fluid, free exchange and rearrangement constantly. In full freedom of each individual, fully known and accepted by each of the others, who also spontaneously rearranges himself in a fluid movement of relations. You can see what that means. So this would be an experience in utter freedom, not in binding. But if you replicate that idea in current consciousness, it would be an experience of crushing suffocation of freedom. So there are things like this of which one can speak of, but if the form is caught without the deeper experience, then we would have the very opposite outcome. When he is speaking of the physical transformation and what material will be used, he uses this word radioactive because the man suggested it. And says, yes, that also is possible. But he did not on his own suggest it, because then you would have people quoting Sri Aurobindo saying, oh, Sri Aurobindo said the supramental body will be a radioactive body. So let's radiate our bodies with uranium, and that's how we will get transformed. There are people who will think like that and maybe even attempt it. We don't know the limits of human stupidity. And Sri Aurobindo knew them. So he was very careful. But the principle he presents, and the principle is that the moment the supramental consciousness creates the basis, it is able to apply directly its powers on material substance, shape them as its means of expression, bypassing physical laws. That means substance would have all the characteristics of the spiritual substance, though now in material substance. You can now step it forward and anticipate what that would mean, including the capacity for tissue to be materialized and dematerialized, reshaped, made dense, made subtle, made hard, made soft at will. And then you can also understand why Mother describes in the supramental world, she says, the clothes were an expression of the consciousness. And those who had a less developed consciousness, they were as if without clothes. Because everything at that point becomes a spontaneous expression of the spirit. And all substance follows state of consciousness and will of consciousness. It could even, as an experiment, take up material from earth and digest it like that, absorb into the body, isn't it? Because after all, digestion is stuck to our stomach because it follows biological processes there. It needs those chemicals there. The moment you've bypassed it and it's direct digestion by Agni consciousness on matter, then that consciousness is not locked into that location. It is all over. It can take up material and absorb it directly as digested material. These are possibilities we can speculate. They are logical outcomes of what we are discussing. But for Sri Aurobindo to have spoken of such things freely would have opened him to ridicule, for sure.
Can we say or imagine that because the transformation and extent of the supramental, it's our perception to the material which will be changed. I mean, our perception change and not really the material.
If we have a change of perception to matter, then you have what Sri Aurobindo calls a subjective realization. I experience that change, but you don't experience it. That's a subjective realization. I may, for example, have the experience of seeing everything as being substance of divine. But at the same time, when my hand gets hit and hurt, I will see divine action on divine action, but there'll still be pain, bleeding. I'll be subject to the laws of matter, and you will still see the same substance as you saw it. But when the substance is transformed, it becomes an objective experience. The tissue will be free of compulsion of being cut, of bleeding, of being damaged, of deteriorating, degenerating, or aging. And that will be an objective experience shared by all. So it's not a subjective change.
Yes, but what I understand, I mean, if you speak about subject and object, it's coming from the mind. When I spoke about about the perception, and I'm speaking about this, the supramental man. I don't know how it will be this person,
Yeah.
but I'm not speaking about the mind. So
Yeah.
is it possible that the supramental will change the material,
Yes.
and not that the material will be changed to receive the supramental?
Yes, both happens. The supramental changes the material. And once the material is changed, then automatically it is also receptive to the supramental consciousness and responds to it. Both movements happen. And Sri Aurobindo also makes this observation, the fact that there will be even one supramental being on earth in this substance of supermind, automatically it will have a rippling out effect on everything in evolution. The very presence of this will lead to a whole series of chain reactions. Now, what we can see purely from our level of experience with the human tissue, the fact that there is this human living tissue here, now on earth, has an effect on animal life because of human interaction with animals. The dogs, cats, monkeys who grow up with human beings automatically have a certain push in the potential of their mental development. And it's pushed as far as their biology can support. And perhaps if we wait a little longer, we might even see the biology changing in these animals to take it a little further. But if the same animals, dogs, cats, apes, had grown up in the forest without human contact, their level of intelligence development would be far lower. So just the fact that I have a mental consciousness and I interact with my pet animal creates a kind of a infusion of my mind consciousness into him and helps his evolution. The supermind, supramental being on earth, even if I do not have a personal interaction with him, the impact of it on the whole earth would be such that it would push everything and change everything. Even, he says, down to the level of plants, there would be changes. So it's quite a radical impact that it will have. Already the state of attainment that Sri Aurobindo and the mother achieved in their own consciousness, the transformation of their mind and vital and the subtle physical, has had its impact on earth. We just are too close to the event to see it. And all we can say is the pace of change, the pace of growth and of human beings, the evolution of the human mind in these last 60 years is unprecedented. It's like the change which would take thousands of years normally to stabilize, but that's the kind of change that has already happened. And that was part of the work that they did. The change in the human consciousness.
Yes. Okay. Sorry, but the last question.
Sure, feel free.
This is what I was thinking, that since we know the being human, the human, he changed in the evolution his mind, he changed his consciousness,
Yes.
but not his body. So is the supramental now will be a radical change of the material?
The human being, as his mental consciousness has developed, he has also changed his body. It has changed. Only it has changed slowly and not dramatically. For example, our body has a kind of subtlety of consciousness which you do not find in apes, which are our nearest cousins biologically. The subtlety of consciousness that we have, they do not have. This subtlety we have developed. The mind awakening has had its effect on the physical consciousness and has made it more subtle. For example, the outcome of that subtlety in the tissue is that we are able to make the body do things such as dance, which the ape would not be able to do, even if it tries. It can dance, but in a very crude way. But we are able to bring it to a level of refinement and harmony which demands a change in the physical consciousness. You see, and a lot of this now is coming up in a strong way. Mother spoke of how there would be a widespread shift, and especially in those who train the physical consciousness, in the form of the body. And the body would become more and more androgynous, difference between men and women becoming less, becoming more elegant in its form, more archetypal, if we may say. But you see this happening on a large scale today in the younger generations. The moment they take to some physical activity, even if it's just for keep fit, you see a change. And I see children and their parents next to each other, and you cannot say they are of the same gene pool. And the difference is only this, that they paid attention to their physical consciousness, or rather something in them compelled an awakening in the physical consciousness, whatever form it is. And there's a difference already in the form, in a single generation. And this is happening from the awakening that's taking place internally. The large number of people who have that flexibility and the capacity to express spontaneously harmony in the body, that increase is also quite dramatic. There's recently a lot of prominence coming to this through certain television programs. One series which is called So You Think You Can Dance. If you get a chance to see that, it's worth seeing. Where people from the public, not professionals, are allowed to come on stage to demonstrate their prowess in dance. And one can see some extraordinary talent and skill. And considering that they are not professionals, one wonders how they developed so much. And there were a few examples where a young child, he's not even reached his teens. He is like 11 or so. And from his school, he was just sent, and he became among the semi-finalists, along with these adults who had been working so much. And still, there was a spontaneity in his actions. All of these show something happening at that level. It's widespread. It's not obviously connected with the biological lineage of the parents. It seems to pop up also out of the blue. But it is certainly helped when there is a good culture in the family tradition. But all of these show a pressure behind the scenes, a subliminal pressure on the physical consciousness to shape it and awaken it, which Mother had spoken of in the 60s. She said the two signs that the supermind is acting in the material consciousness would be first change of the body form and second change of weather patterns. Both of these we are seeing quite clearly. Weather patterns. The weather patterns would change, yes. And of that she said, the extremes would become less. The whole Earth's climate would change to become more and more temperate. And the hotter regions would become cooler, colder regions would become warmer. And that's what's happening, and it's happening from both extremes, so scientists are confused. Is the Earth heating or cooling? And actually there are measurements showing both. From the satellites, we find the upper atmosphere is cooling down. On the ground, we find the atmosphere is heating up. So what's the average? And they always think in terms of average. And it's not the average, it's the spread, the extremes which are narrowing. And even if the average wanders a little bit, it's not going to affect life on Earth too much because the extremes are narrowing. In fact, life will have a freer and more diverse play. There's another interesting process taking place, measured by science but still unexplained, which is called global dimming. We find that the sunlight reaching the surface of the Earth is becoming less by 3% every decade. And this process has started only after 1956. It has been observed from 1957 and 58 onwards. This is after the supramental manifestation has taken place. It has started a process that we are able to measure, but we can't explain. There is no change in cloud cover. There is no change in particulate matter, which can explain this kind of light reduction. And in some parts of Siberia, the total accumulated light reduction is as much as 27% of what it used to be. And in other parts of the world, on the average, 3% per decade. So since then, it has crossed 15%. So there is 15% less sunlight reaching the whole Earth's surface since 1956. How? And we still have no idea. There is no scientific measurement corresponding to this which could explain this. It's just happening. So there are things happening on a level. Yes, the supramental consciousness will use processes of nature also, but it also from within begins to modify the processes. And what will be the final outcome is certainly greater harmony. So we leave aside the letters, and you can see they are quite suggestive and interesting. The idea of how Agni would produce the same result without needing change of temperature gives you the first clue of how the functions of the supramentalized body will be. And in a later chapter, Sri Aurobindo speaks of this in some elaboration. He says it will not be by organs and process of organs and chemicals, but by centers of consciousness organizing themselves and the consciousness directly doing the thing needed. And he connects that to the chakras and certain insights which come from the occult traditions. But we'll take all that up later. So right now we were speaking of the consciousness rising from matter towards spirit, but carrying matter with it in the process, and the spirit descending to fill the form and bringing into it all of its lights and glories and powers, transforming the life in the material world, not on some other level, but right down here. And the transformation, if we continue the text, the transformation is not a change into something purely subtle and spiritual, to which matter is in its nature repugnant, by which it is felt as an obstacle or a shackle binding the spirit. It takes up matter as a form of the spirit. And instead of concealing, it's revealing. That's the difference. It does not cast away the energies of matter, its capacities, its methods. Now this is another interesting point. Material energy, what we may call electromagnetic fields, nuclear energy, electric fields, and all of these processes by which matter operates, they are not thrown away. Rather, they are taken up and made conscious. So you can imagine what that means. I'll share another interesting example here. This is a person I had occasion to meet last year. He is now 96. I've mentioned him before here as founder of a community in Switzerland. As a young boy, he used to walk into the forest and meet these beings who came as children, and they would teach him. And as he grew older, they grew with him, so to say. And later, when he established his spiritual community under that inspiration, he used to teach. And although not formally educated in school because he was always skipping school, he taught many things which were far more profound. And then I heard these examples from people who were part of these sessions. He would take a compass, which is a magnetic thing. It's pointing north and south. He would run his finger over it, and then we find it's not responding anymore. Its magnetism is gone. He'd take a piece of metal, run his finger over it, it would get magnetized, and it would be like a compass. Again, he runs his finger over it, and it's lost its magnetism. He would take a full magnet, running his hand over it, the magnetism is gone. It's like a normal piece of iron. It doesn't attract anything. Again, he runs his hand over it, and it becomes magnetic. Now, this is an ability which he demonstrated, not to show how great he was. His message was, this is the power available in our spiritual consciousness. And we have to bring this out and change our life so that we live by the Spirit and not by these laws. There was something of this idea of changing life, bringing out these powers, maybe even transforming. But he demonstrated what would be normally called material energies being instantly responsive to the action of consciousness. And he said, each one of us is like the magnet. We are the metal of the magnet without the magnetic power. And to bring the spiritual force in us is to dynamize the magnet. So he used to use these kinds of examples to communicate his message. But when Sri Aurobindo uses this word, energies of matter, it does not cast away the energies of matter. We actually include all of these physics energies, physical energies. There's another mentalist, I believe it was Ingo Swann. He was taken to one of the particle accelerators in these physics labs in Europe. And what they said was when he walked into that space, many of the particle detectors went off. And he was able, by his thought, to modify some of the particle acceleration, the particle collision patterns which were created in the lab, and increase or reduce some. I've only heard this description in these words. I never saw documentation showing these things. Perhaps the scientists were embarrassed, and if they ever chose to publish documentation of this kind, they would be thrown out from the community. So they were afraid to document it. But these descriptions do exist of people being able to do such things. Or even the more common thing, which is bending spoons by stroking the metal, and the metal bends, breaks. These are things which are real powers. Currently, they are occult powers. They involve the operation of a non-physical principle brought into the physical substance in an artificial, unnatural way. The transformed consciousness will have the spirit self in matter as the presiding principle. And if spirit is utterly free, then its utter freedom is expressed through material substance as its natural expression, not by miracle, not by abnormal utilization of power. That would be the difference in the transformed body. But still, the energies of matter are involved. The capacities and methods of matter are involved. Electricity will still be electricity. Magnetism will still be magnetism, but they would be expressions of spirit rather than compulsions of laws of matter. It brings out their hidden possibilities, uplifts, sublimates, discloses their innate divinity. Now, if just to go back to the example of these forces, of the four forces, as they say, electrical attraction, magnetic attraction, strong force, weak force. Now they speak of a fifth possibly. But the point is, whatever the force, acting at an atomic level, what is it really? In terms of consciousness, it is nothing but action of this bound consciousness that you call particle upon that bound consciousness that you call particle. And the action is nothing but the Shakti of consciousness, the conscious force of consciousness in somnambulistic relation, that is half sleep. In half sleep, by mechanical movement and repetition, it's consciousness and force of consciousness working on consciousness and force of consciousness. That's what creates the material world. Except it's asleep, it's inconscient, mechanically repeating its rhythms. And we call those rhythms laws. When the supermind enters into this consciousness, awakens the consciousness, it seizes the force of consciousness and fills it with its free conscious force. What does it mean? The same electric attraction, magnetic attraction, strong force, weak force are now consciously expressed by spirit. And then in its consciousness, it can increase or reduce, modify as it chooses. So these are hidden possibilities which are awakened, uplifted, sublimated, disclosing their innate divinity. In other words, at this point, the person so transformed actually experiences all his tissue and cells and atoms and its molecules and atoms, as the natural expression of the self taking form directly. And the divinity which is innate in the atom, now asleep, has been awakened and revealed. All tissue of his body would be substance, physical substance of self. That's the only way we can describe it at that point. He continues, the divine life will reject nothing that is capable of divinization. All is to be seized, exalted, made utterly perfect. I think we will pause here and I skip. We'll continue the text later, but the last line of this para, it may even in the end be suffused with a light and beauty and bliss from the beyond, and the life divine assume a body divine. So it's not just taking off of material energies, but infusing in them the light and beauty and bliss of the Satchidananda through the very substance of matter. An experience we cannot even imagine, but we can only see purely as an increase or exaggeration of our existing material experiences. But it is not that, it is something fundamentally different. So this is just the beginning of this chapter. For the rest, then he takes up all the discussions of what has now been set as a base, and how the body needs to be reviewed no more as an obstacle, but as an instrument to reveal what are the various methods used so far in different traditions for awakening the body consciousness, what is the approach we would take, and so on. It's a long one. We can just pause here and take up any other questions.
You spoke about some evolved spiritual person coming to Sri Aurobindo, and it reminds me a question while reading talks with Sri Aurobindo near Ireland. They evoke one moment the problematic situation of mixing spiritual forces and bringing some disease for some people going from one guru to another.
Right.
And so it has been floating in my mind, saying, okay, I have a general question and a personal question. The general one is that I meet quite a lot of people who are going from one place to another, one guru to another, and I would like to know to which extent is harming their own sadhana. To go to see Amma and for my personal question, when I go back to Belgium, I think they having to go to a Tibetan Buddhist center to go meditate, because somehow I feel the energy is more strong there, because every day people are meditating there. And regarding that question, should I avoid to go there because risk of mixing spiritual force, or is not problematic?
Yes. Regarding the first question of people going through several gurus, this can be looked at 3 levels. The lowest is a large number of people are attracted to spirituality but are not really committed to a spiritual realization. They feel good in the presence of a spiritual person, they feel uplifted, they enjoy that, they are satisfied with it. After a while, their excitement of something new fades, and now they need another new excitement of uplift of some kind. For these people, it makes no difference. And at best, one can say that something in the inner being is preparing for a real spiritual commitment. And this is all basking in the various kinds of light, so to say. At the second level is a person who is committed to a spiritual life, takes help of whoever is around him, but somehow feels something missing. So although he accepted X because there was none other, he moves to Y after a while because he feels Y has something which he was missing. But still after a while he realizes, having grown, Y did help me, but there's still something missing, and I move to Z. Now, here it can be an insincerity. There are people who have an ego issue, and in their spiritual pursuit, they are busy choosing what they can take from a person because they already know what they know and what they want. And that's really the problem they have. And it doesn't get them too far. They may even at some point, having read a lot, met a lot of people, take on postures and say, that's it, I have reached where I had to, and that's it. There's nothing more to be done. I've met a few people like that. They just one day woke up and that was it. Now I'm enlightened, whatever that means. So I had a discussion with one of them saying, enlightenment is different from self-realization. And I said, oh, is that so? What's the difference? But because there has not been even an understanding of the journey and the goals possible. But considering that the person is genuine and not so confused or blocked up, he moves on, looking for something which he knows exists, but he has not found it. And when he finds it, that's it. I've come to my guru. And he stops the searching there. That's fine. That's acceptable. And one can then look at all the past teachers as steps who assisted, people who assisted to bring him to his destined place. There are those who, having had that realization, still have a kind of a vital restlessness and need some kind of drama or external devices. And there is a certain danger. So that comes to the third level, where having found one's way, having found one's guru, having been accepted, and the guru has taken spiritual responsibility for you. At that point, to wander and accept someone else as guru for initiation or anything is spiritually extremely damaging. And in one particular letter, Sri Aurobindo says to someone, this person asked to get initiation from his family's traditional guru. And Sri Aurobindo said, since you have come here, we have taken responsibility for your spiritual development and taken upon ourselves the burden of your karma. If at this point you go and take initiation from the other person, all of that thing will return to you again. And this is, you can see how damaging that can be spiritually. So in this third case, it can have severe consequences. And the protection there is the deep sincerity. And if there has been something of the psychic influence in the being, then it will feel odd. It will feel strange when something is not all right. What is all right, though, is that in meeting people who have a higher spiritual development than us, to be in a relationship of learning, to be open to the spiritual consciousness or knowledge that comes through them, but with the discrimination. That discrimination is difficult to define in intellectual terms, but is sensed in the purity of the psychic vibration. Because sometimes you have people who are, so to say, beautiful channels for a force, but often introducing mixtures or having very confused philosophies. So there is an energy that comes which has a beauty, but the teaching is confused and even dangerously wrong at points. Or the reverse, where they speak all the right words, say all the right things, make all the right actions, but the energy behind is an occult energy, not a spiritual. And even can have very dramatic forms because it is occult and vital, but can actually lead you astray spiritually or harm you spiritually. And sometimes if it is like that, then the occult energy even wants to feed on your spiritual energy and drains you spiritually. I had occasion to see that happen once. This was in a conference where a person of some spiritual realization was to speak. And just before he was to speak, somebody else came to him who was also a teacher in a different tradition, but a tradition which has some occult practices. And he sat there talking to this teacher, and the teacher's spouse saw what was happening and she got very agitated and she made gestures to him to get away. She tried to break that conversation, but she failed. And later they told me this. They said he was sucking all his spiritual force and left him drained. He had come prepared for what he had to give, and he was completely drained of that and he had to struggle with it. And they said if you observed, after he had done that sucking of the energy, he was sitting there basking in what he had taken in. It's a kind of a occult vampirism of feeding on another's energy, not vital energy in this case, even spiritual energy. They suck rather than receive. And there's a big difference between the two. And sometimes, and in this case he was a teacher, he has his own students. One does not know what he does with his students. So they're attracted to points of light, especially purity and clarity of light, and they tend to feed on that unknowingly. Sometimes they're conscious. In this case, they said they felt the person was conscious. He had done certain practices to have that. But many cases they are not conscious. They feed on such things. One has to be vigilant in such matters, and the only vigilance one can have, or the only clarity one can have, is in the psychic light, which is why it's so important to have that sensitivity awakened. If you feel uncomfortable, it's better to stay away. I've had some beautiful experiences with people of other traditions where I felt a pure spiritual force flowing. Sometimes what I felt was mixed. And occasionally, and this was strange, where the teaching sounded good, it had all the purity, even the external forms had great sattvic purity. But being in the presence during certain gatherings, I felt suffocating and I could not stay, and I had to just walk out to be free and get back my fresh air, so to say. I don't know what it was, but there was something odd I felt and I just left. But that sensitivity is our only protection in such matters. Does that complete what you... Okay. When somebody truly in the spiritual tradition, in a spiritual attitude, without the personal ego predominating or these control issues or vital mixtures, is present, even if his realizations are not perfect as the way we seek, and of course we don't have, or as our masters have, even then there can be a very beautiful relationship of support of our common aspiration and ideals. And in that there can be something that happens spontaneously, that being together in that shared ideal and aspiration from different traditions, differently formulated, there is something which comes as a presence, which each sees in his own framework, but which nourishes everyone, holds everyone together, nurtures and raises everybody spiritually. And those are very rare occasions one can have, and those can be very precious in what they give to all involved, including the teachers, including the students. So if such an occasion comes your way, certainly it is very important even for the spiritual evolution, where all these traditions must meet in consciousness, although they have different terms and philosophical objectives. But in consciousness, as long as we are touching that in whatever aspect, they all can meet and support each other and nourish each other. Mother had wanted to encourage that, and where such occasions come, and they will come more frequently now, we have to assist it. There's a term which was used in one such meeting. Someone spoke of interspiritual meetings. And I reacted to that. I said, spirit is one. The moment you speak of interspiritual, you're making a big mess, because you cannot have two things spiritual separate. And then you will need another word for the oneness of spirit. please keep the lower words of inter-religious, but keep spiritual as one. Don't make inter-spiritual. Then one of the persons who used that term explained to me that this term was coined by someone called William T. Ling, I think. And he used it in a specific context when two different traditions awaken to their spirituality and then meet in recognition of the common source, though differently stated. Then he calls that inter-spiritual. So I said, okay, if you define it in those terms, that I can accept. But limited to those terms. Not speaking of two different spiritualities, two different spirits meeting. But such interchanges need to grow. And that's how we will build as if threads connecting all the traditions in a larger fulfillment of humanity. I think we can stop with that idea. Sri Aurobindo is not presenting to us an aspect of the divine truth. He presents the integral vision of the divine in which all these aspects are held together. So from such a vision, we should be able to see all traditions as threads or lines of development, all leading to that same truth. And we should be able to see it and relate to them in that integrality without any differences of any kind. That's part of the work we have to do in ourselves.